Right now, we're pleased to be joined by Dr. Sally Satel of the American Enterprise Institute, lecturer at Yale University, a practicing psychiatrist, and somebody who puts the word mindless and brainwashed in the title of your most recent book. Dr. Satel, where are we going here?
Thanks. Well, actually, the other choice was 50 Shades of Gray Matter. But the idea is, and actually 50 Shades of Gray Matter and the subtitle both speak to the concept of seduction. And my co-author and I wrote this book and it attempted injecting some neuroliteracy into a conversation that was all too carried away often by overinterpretation of brain scans. Brain scans are pretty much the signature of modern neuroscience, and they're beautiful, they're arresting, they play into people's kind of sense of surprise that, my goodness, you mean my thoughts are in my brain? My math anxiety is in the brain? Depression? Well, of course, where else would it be? We're not endorsing a dualist view. That's all true. But what comes along with this notion that there are neural correlates to our thoughts and our emotions is that we can't control them. Because something is in the brain, then somehow that means we're not responsible for the behavior that emerges. These behaviors are involuntary. Now, clearly, there are some kinds of behaviors and actions that people can't control. They have certain kinds of defects or brain damage. But the simple fact that we can see, we can visualize increased neural activity in the brain manifest as a lit up brain scan is not the same thing as saying that a person could not control themselves. And that the implications for moral agency and personal responsibility in this age of neuroscience is very interesting to us, because we're going to only get better and better and better at generating biological explanations of behavior. We're going to learn more and more about how the brain works, the mechanisms behind our impulses and our decisions. But we shouldn't fall or be seduced into this notion that we can't control what happens because we're thinking about ourselves mechanistically. They're not the same thing at all. You can imagine that trial lawyers love this idea. That's why brain scans are becoming almost a requirement in capital cases. Look, Your Honor, you can see this particular neural signature shows my client couldn't form intent, couldn't control himself, couldn't be deterred. Now, there are people who can't form intent and can't reason and can't be deterred because of brain pathology, but we can't yet tell who those people are based on a brain scan. So a lot of caution is needed in interpreting them. And some people have made careers out of what I would argue is misinterpreting them. We call them neuro-entrepreneurs. There's a company called No Lie MRI, which can supposedly tell whether you're telling the truth or not. It's not yet been admissible in court, although some people do use it. A lot of cheating spouses apparently use it. See, honey, I wasn't doing it. This brain scan said so. Now, to be fair, and we have a whole chapter on lie detection, there are some interesting findings in detecting neural signatures of lies versus the truth, but they're done in a highly controlled experimental situation that cannot yet be generalized to people in a forensic or a situation where they go into this no lie MRI and are able to present that as truth.
Now, Dr. Satel, you have a story in here about a retired ad exec in New York City who killed his wife, escaped down the fire escape, and they found a tumor. But you say the tumor had nothing to do with his behavior. Is that a correct interpretation?
Well, it's not my interpretation. Actually, it's the interpretation of the neurologist who examined him. Yeah, that's an interesting case. This was one of the first cases of what's called neuro law. the idea of, again, trying to show through some manifestation of neural defect that a person was not responsible. In this particular case, executive, I think his name was Herbert Weinstein, this was in the late 80s, had a fight with his wife and he threw her out the window, but he hoped to make it look like a suicide. I think he strangled her, then he threw her out the window, and then the police caught him on his way out. But his defense team didn't know what to do, and they thought, oh God, let's just do a brain scan, maybe something will come up. And this was in the late 80s, so it was only a few years after PET scanning had become popular. And to their amazement, they found that he had actually had a benign brain tumor. However, the brain tumor was growing very slow, had taken years to develop, because if you have a physiological change that's rapid, there would be clinical manifestations. You'd have a horrible headache, you probably would have weakness, you'd have problems with your thinking and your impulse control if you had a frontal lobe problem. And he had none of that. He just obviously had a bad temper. Well, to make a long story short, it was a very dramatic brain scan that they showed. And he actually did get off. Or I should say he got a much reduced sentence. I think that's what happened. That example is one of what's called structural neuroimaging. In other words, they showed this tumor. Most of the neuroimaging that we talk about in terms of trying to infer aspects of the mind from looking at the brain is a functional neuroimaging, which measures either blood flow or metabolic activity in the brain as various areas are engaged when a person thinks about a certain thing or feels a certain way. But the brain scan worked the way it's supposed to work, because to the extent that it has great rhetorical power. The idea is that, again, if it's in the brain, the person's less responsible. We have very interesting data, many studies that converge on these same findings with the more you describe a behavior in terms of biological explanations, like it was the genes, or again, it was some neurological problem, versus a bad childhood or some other kind of psychological explanation, people are more likely to withhold punishment if it were a crime. If the behavior is explained in a biological way, they are less likely to, like I said, less likely to blame, less intense punishment. Interestingly, the flip side is they're more pessimistic about the person's capacity to respond to treatment. They also think that the person is more dangerous and want to keep more of a social distance. Now, none of that is an argument for using one explanation over another. We want to be as realistic as possible, but there are implications to the way we describe behavior.
Dr. Sally Satel is our guest, co-author of Brainwashed, the Seductive Appeal of Mindless Neuroscience. You've heard a little bit of what she writes about in this book. Let's take some calls. Elaine in Dowagiac, Michigan. Hi, Elaine.
Hi.
Please go ahead, ma'am. We're listening.
Okay. I've read a little bit about differences in male and female brains. For instance, Leonard Sax's book about educating boys and girls. Could you expand a little bit on differences between male brains and female brains? Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Well, actually, the male, it's not very helpful to talk about the male brain and female brain, although I understand that's often how it's referred to. I think a little too much is made of that. I do believe that there are some differences that are innate, male-female differences. I certainly believe that. It manifests in the brain in certain ways. But in terms of teaching children, these kind of differences are quite subtle and don't really figure in at all. And in fact, there aren't even, we've heard a lot about learning styles even that is quite overblown, as many neuroscientists who specialize in education will tell you. There's the visual learners versus auditory learners, or kinesthetic learners, people who feel things, can actually manipulate things, and that's how they learn. That's